Think about the layout of a massive apartment building. You live on the ground floor.
Right, nice and convenient.
Exactly. But then a pipe bursts way up in Unit 4B, and for a while, you don't even notice.
Because it's floors above you.
Right. But water follows the path of least resistance, so it seeps through the floorboards, it travels down the drywall, maybe it shorts out the electrical grid on the second floor.
And then eventually your own ceiling just completely caves in.
Exactly, right into your living room. And global conflict, it operates on that exact same physical logic. So today, we are taking a deep dive into the invisible ripple effects of regional wars.
Which is frankly something we all need to be paying closer attention to.
Oh, 100%. We're looking at how a border clash, thousands of miles away, secretly dictates the price of the groceries you bought this morning, the cost to heat your home, and really just the overall stability of the world you live in.
And we have some incredible material to pull from today.
We really do. To map all this out, we're pulling from a super robust stack of sources. We've got academic excerpts analyzing conflict spillovers, a really comprehensive international policy report on preventative mediation, and some fascinating strategic insights from the DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute.
It's a great mix of, hard data and high-level strategy.
Yeah, and the mission here is twofold, really. First, we need to unpack the actual mechanics of how modern wars cross borders.
Right.
And second, we are exploring this radical shift in global policy. Governments are finally realizing they can't just keep putting out fires, they have to fireproof the building.
Which is such a massive structural change.
Yeah, they are attempting to treat peace as a core upfront policy rather than just a post-war afterthought.
And I think it's important to stress that it is a profound shift in how the international community approaches statecraft. I mean, historically, foreign policy has treated war as a localized containment issue.
Like a tragedy that just happens, quote unquote, over there.
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at make it crystal clear that in a hyper-connected global economy, the over-there war is a complete myth.
It just doesn't exist anymore.
No, it doesn't. A localized conflict, physically and economically, travels across the globe through very specific traceable mechanisms. And the academic literature identifies three main pathways for this spillover effect.
Okay, so if we follow the water leaking from Unit 4B, the first major pathway the sources identify is just the sheer movement of people. Refugee and migration flows.
Right, because when armed conflict forces civilians to flee, they don't just disappear.
No, they cross borders, usually into neighboring countries that, honestly, are often already struggling economically themselves.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
We're looking at massive, immediate strains on housing markets, heavy competition for local jobs, and just the rapid depletion of public services. Things like healthcare and sanitation in those host countries.
And that sudden strain creates a secondary security dynamic. The research really emphasizes that when massive populations of refugees lack legal rights to work and lack basic physical protection, that systemic exclusion breeds broader insecurity.
It destabilizes the host nation's political equilibrium.
Exactly. We even see this sparking cross-border military tensions. So, a host government might start intervening defensively in the neighboring conflict just to stop the flow of people at the source.
Or the government of the origin state might cross the border to pursue political dissidents who are hiding among the refugee populations.
Right, so the conflict literally physically expands its own borders.
Which introduces massive friction into the region's economy, feeding directly into the second pathway, which is economic and market disruptions.
Because conflict zones aren't isolated islands.
Right. They are nodes in a massive global supply chain network. The moment violence hits a major commodity exporter or, say, threatens a key maritime shipping route, the global market reacts preemptively.
And the mechanics of that reaction are just fascinating. It isn't just about a single factory shutting down. It's all about risk calculation.
How so?
Well, if a shipping route is threatened by regional violence, maritime insurance companies immediately spike their premiums for vessels traveling through that area.
Right, because the risk of losing a ship goes way up.
Exactly. And to avoid those astronomical costs, shipping conglomerates will just reroute their freighters around entire continents.
Oh, wow, like going all the way around Africa instead of through a canal?
Exactly. And that adds weeks to transit times, burns millions of dollars in extra marine fuel, and drastically reduces the availability of shipping containers worldwide.
So that localized violence has now engineered a global logistics bottleneck.
Yes, leading to immediate inflation. The cost of energy, raw materials, basic consumer goods, it all spikes worldwide because the transportation overhead basically just doubled overnight.
which is wild. And then you have the third pathway, which is just institutional collapse, the humanitarian system overload.
Yeah, this one's pretty bleak.
Our sources outline how the global aid architecture, the UN, major international NGOs, they're built to handle a certain baseline of crisis.
Right, they have a capacity limit.
But when you have large-scale simultaneous conflicts generating millions of displaced people all at once, that architecture just structurally buckled.
It does, and
Yeah.
it creates this really dangerous environment of donor fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, to put the scale into perspective, the data shows that in recent years, record-setting UN humanitarian appeals regularly end up underfunded by 50% or more.
50%.
Yeah, or more.
Yeah.
There simply isn't enough capital to go around. So personnel, emergency budgets, logistical resources, they're constantly being diverted away from chronic, ongoing crises.
Just to funnel them toward whatever the newest, most telegenic emergency is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You end up leaving incredibly vulnerable populations and older conflict zones entirely without protection or sustenance simply because the budget ran out.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that failure for a second. Looking at the data in the policy report, I'm trying to understand, is the humanitarian system merely underfunded, or is it fundamentally mismatched for the reality of the modern world? Especially when you factor in the environmental data the sources provide regarding climate shocks.
That's a great question. The literature strongly argues for the latter. It is structurally mismatched.
Yeah.
The current aid system operates in specialized silos. So you have your food aid people over here, your medical people there, your housing people somewhere else.
Right, very compartmentalized.
But the sources describe a nonlinear interaction between conflict, mass displacement, and climate events. Climate basically acts as the ultimate threat multiplier.
So they don't just add together, they multiply.
Exactly. If you have 2 million people displaced by violence living in a temporary, densely packed border camp, and you introduce a severe, climate shock-like, unseasonal, catastrophic flooding, it doesn't just add a new problem to the list, it multiplies all the existing vulnerabilities.
Because the flooding physically destroys whatever temporary infrastructure they had. It wipes out the latrines, contaminates the drinking water, and suddenly you have acute water insecurity.
Right.
And then that overcrowding combined with dirty water just accelerates the spread of infectious waterborne diseases like cholera.
Which is terrifying in a camp setting.
Yeah, and the disease outbreak then incapacitates the remaining aid workers and overwhelms the few standing health facilities. It's a cascading systemic failure that a siloed approach to aid simply cannot manage.
And we can see these three mechanisms, the migration, the market disruption, and the systemic overload operating perfectly if we just lay them over a map of the last decade.
Yeah, let's look at that.
The sources provide several post-2010 case studies that demonstrate how these pathways literally reshape the globe. The most prominent recent example, of course, is the 2022 war in Ukraine.
Right, and the logistics of that spillover are staggering. You have the immediate humanitarian reality, which was 6 to 8 million refugees flowing outward.
Predominantly into the European Union.
Yeah, triggering massive housing and administrative burdens there. But the economic shockwave was arguably even broader. I mean, before the conflict, Ukraine and Russia supplied roughly 30% of the world's exported wheat, corn, and essential agricultural fertilizers.
30% is a massive chunk of the global food supply.
And the conflict effectively barricaded the Black Sea ports.
And if we look at how that impacts you, the listener, it's not just that bread gets more expensive at your local grocery store. Modern agriculture relies heavily on specific chemical fertilizers.
Right.
So with European natural gas supplies disrupted by the conflict, fertilizer production plummeted. That means farmers in South America or sub-Saharan Africa literally couldn't afford the nutrients needed for their next planting season.
Wow. So the conflict didn't just disrupt current food supplies, it mathematically guaranteed lower crop yields globally for the following year.
Precisely. Which drove commodity futures through the roof and exacerbated poverty and hunger in nations that are really heavily reliant on imports, like Egypt and Lebanon.
Which just shows how connected it all is. And then you look at Yemen, a devastating civil war that began in 2015. On a traditional map of global superpowers, some might view the region as peripheral.
Sure, historically speaking.
But the conflict mechanics prove otherwise. As the war evolved, Houthi forces began targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
And that is one of the most vital maritime choke points on the planet.
Exactly. And the impact was instantaneous. Energy conglomerates like BP and Shell had to completely suspend their shipments through that route.
It completely demonstrates that a conflict doesn't need to involve a major global superpower to to cripple the global economy.
Not at all.
If localized violence touches a strategic transit artery, it dictates global energy prices. It raises the cost of filling your car with gas and slows down overall global economic growth because everything suddenly costs more to move.
Yeah. And the demographic spillovers are just as potent. The sources point to the conflict in Syria, which began in 2011 and generated over 6 million refugees.
A truly massive displacement.
Yeah, and the researchers tracking this demographic movement note a very specific political spillover. According to the data analyzed in the reports, the sudden influx of displaced persons into European municipalities during the 2015 and 2016 migration crisis severely strained local budgets and social services.
Right.
And the research actually draws a direct correlation between this specific demographic shift and the visible acceleration of far-right nationalist political movements across Europe.
It really is a clear demonstration of how a regional civil war can fundamentally rewrite the domestic political landscape of countries thousands of miles away from the actual violence.
Exactly. We're just conveying what the data shows here, but it's undeniable how those ripples spread.
And we really have to broaden our definition of what even constitutes a conflict spillover. I mean, the literature also examines Venezuela starting around 2015.
Right, which wasn't a traditional armed war.
No, it was a profound internal political and economic collapse. Yet it still displaced nearly 8 million people throughout Latin America.
8 million.
Yeah, placing incredible economic and social strain on neighboring countries like Colombia and Peru. Furthermore, the internal collapse completely devastated Venezuela's infrastructure, dropping their daily oil production from 3.2 million barrels to under 1 million.
That is a huge drop.
Massive. That huge chunk of energy vanished from the market, which tightened global oil supplies and altered international energy diplomacy.
Okay, I do want to push back on one aspect of this analysis, though.
Sure.
When we talk about Ukraine's grain or Yemen's shipping routes, it sounds like we are entirely blaming regional conflict for the fragility of globalized trade. But weren't these supply chains, these just-in-time agricultural and energy markets, already dangerously vulnerable before a single shot was even fired?
I'm glad you brought that up because they absolutely were inherently fragile. But the sources highlight a critical distinction here. Conflicts don't just expose fragility, they actively weaponize it.
Okay, what's fascinating here is how that actually plays out on the ground.
Right, because in a standard supply chain crisis, say, a massive storm closes a port, the surrounding infrastructure mostly remains intact.
Yeah.
You wait out the weather, you clear the backlog, and the system recovers.
Because the banks and the roads are still there.
Exactly. But armed conflict physically and institutionally destroys the recovery mechanism itself. It decimates the marketing boards, the local transport syndicates, the banking services, and the legal frameworks that people actually rely on to conduct trade.
So it's not just a temporary pause, it's a total erasure of the system.
Yes.
So governments and international businesses aren't just trying to reroute a few ships. They are being forced to reconstruct the basic architecture of trade and human survival in an active, hostile environment.
Which is exponentially more complex and expensive than managing a standard supply chain bottleneck.
Right. Which brings us to the core policy shift detailed in the reports. If reacting to these crises after they erupt is breaking the humanitarian bank, spiking global inflation, and destabilizing neighboring democracies, how does the international community actually change its approach?
Well, they're attempting to move toward what the policy analysts call preventive mediation and joined-up institutions.
The whole idea of fireproofing the building.
Exactly. The data clearly shows that the historical siloed approach, handling security policy in one department, refugee policy in another, and humanitarian aid in a third, it severely underperforms.
Because none of them are talking to each other.
Right. So governments are waking up to the fact that you have to treat the root source of the conflict as a core element of your own domestic and foreign policy planning. You have to build mediation directly into the machinery of government.
And the sources provide several really concrete examples of how nations are operationalizing this.
We do. The Nordic countries offer probably the most established models. Norway, for example, has completely restructured its Ministry of Foreign Affairs to include a dedicated section specifically for peace and reconciliation.
And they put real money behind it, too.
They do. They back this department with an annual budget of roughly 400 million Norwegian krone. And this isn't money for troops or food aid. It is dedicated funding for negotiation facilitation. So providing secure venues, flying in rival factions, and maintaining quiet diplomatic back channels before a conflict boils over.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and Finland has launched a dedicated center for mediation, and Sweden has integrated conflict prevention as a foundational pillar of its national security strategy.
And we are seeing larger institutional bodies adopting this logic as well. Like the European Union recently published guidelines that explicitly tether their migration strategy to political peace building.
Which makes perfect sense.
Yeah, they formally acknowledge that you cannot solve the administrative and social challenges of refugee flows without securing a political settlement in the origin countries, like Syria. They are linking the symptoms directly to the disease.
And in the United States, policy architects are pushing what they call the 3D approach: diplomacy, development, and defense.
The 3Ds.
Right. The goal is to force those three historically separate and honestly often competitive branches of government to integrate their planning from day one.
And the United Kingdom provides a really pragmatic example of how you actually force that integration. Post-2010, they established the CSSF, that's the Conflict, Stability, and Security Fund.
Yeah, the genius of this model is in the budget structure itself.
Exactly. It physically blends defense spending and overseas development aid into a single pool of money, managed under the guidance of the National Security Council.
So instead of a military unit securing a volatile town and then just leaving because they don't have the mandate or the budget to restore the local water grid.
Which would just allow insurgents to immediately return.
Right. The CSSF allows diplomats, defense officials, and development workers to jointly plan the operation. The military secures the area, and the development funds are immediately deployed to rebuild the infrastructure, creating actual long-term stability.
And scaling up to the global level, the United Nations has revamped its approach through the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the DPREA. They now maintain a standby team of expert mediation practitioners.
These are highly specialized negotiators. Right.
Yeah, absolute experts. Experts in transitional justice, constitutional drafting, ceasefire logistics, and they're kept on retainer, ready to deploy anywhere in the world in a matter of minutes to advise on emerging crises before the violence escalates.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's essentially paying for a global cybersecurity audit, but for geopolitics.
Oh, that's a great analogy. It's like preventative medicine. Instead of waiting for a heart attack, the global crisis nations are finally investing in a gym membership and a better diet by funding these standing mediation units.
Exactly. No one wants to spend the money when the network is running fine, because the reward is that nothing happens. You are literally buying the absence of a crisis.
By funding these units, nations are realizing that you can't just keep buying expensive defibrillators for a failing system. You have to invest in the preventative medicine upstream.
And by embedding mediation into the daily bureaucratic routine, you transform conflict prevention from a panicked ad hoc response into just a standardized instrument of statecraft.
But, that logic forces a very obvious question. If this preventative approach saves billions in economic damage, prevents mass migration crises, and saves millions of lives, why isn't every nation universally adopting it? What are the roadblocks preventing this highly logical, cost-saving solution from becoming the global standard?
Well, the policy report outlines three massive barriers obstructing this shift. The first is a political phenomenon they call the tyranny of the urgent.
Which perfectly encapsulates the reality of the political news cycle.
Exactly. When a crisis flares up and dominates the headlines, political leaders face intense, immediate pressure from their constituents to just do something.
Right, they need to look active.
They are heavily incentivized by the electoral cycle to rush funding toward visible kinetic responses, like military deployments or massive emergency aid drops. Those actions yield immediate optical results.
You can put it on the evening news.
Exactly. But investing that same capital into long-term quiet diplomacy or preventative mediation doesn't offer any instant political gratification. It is nearly impossible for a politician to cut a ribbon on a war that didn't happen, so the preventative funding constantly gets cannibalized by urgent crises.
Makes total sense. And the second major barrier is rooted in international law, right? Sovereignty concerns.
Right.
States experiencing internal tension or early-stage civil conflict are highly protective of their borders and their autonomy. They often view external offers of mediation, even well-intentioned ones from the UN or the Nordics, as a profound threat to their national sovereignty.
They fear that accepting mediation will sort of internationalize their domestic problems and invite foreign interference in their government.
Right, so leadership will stubbornly refuse diplomatic assistance until the internal violence reaches a catastrophic breaking point.
And then the third roadblock is purely logistical, coordination friction. Even when a nation commits to a joined-up approach like the US 3D model or the UK's CSSS, forcing different government ministries to align is incredibly difficult.
Because you are dealing with a fundamental clash of institutional mandates.
Exactly. You have defense ministries, diplomatic corps, and humanitarian aid agencies all trying to work together, but they operate on completely different timelines, cultures, and risk tolerances.
It sounds like trying to perform a complex surgery where the anesthesiologist and the surgeon are operating in different time zones and speaking different languages. I mean, a defense ministry's entire operating model is based on security and often involves taking a partisan stance against a specific militant group.
Right.
Meanwhile, a humanitarian agency's survival and access to vulnerable populations depend entirely on absolute neutrality.
So the military might fiercely oppose delivering food to a militant-controlled territory, while the aid workers insist on delivering it anyway, based purely on human need.
And those internal bureaucratic frictions can just paralyze preventative action before it even starts.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, failing to overcome these three barriers carries a devastating consequence for the global system. If the world remains stuck in a reactionary posture, it means that peace efforts and humanitarian aid end up being financed by a very small, static group of wealthy donor countries.
Right.
When you only react to crises, that tiny pool of donors bears the entire financial brunt of global instability. This leads directly to structural donor exhaustion. Eventually, the capital simply dries up, and there isn't enough money left to stop the bleeding when the next inevitable crisis hits.
Wow. We've spent a lot of time analyzing UN strategies, European geopolitical shifts, and macroeconomics. But if you are listening to this right now, the vital takeaway is that the mechanics of conflict resolution scale.
They really do.
They scale all the way up to international maritime law, and they scale all the way down to your daily life. The cost of distant conflicts is literally baked into the price of your groceries and your energy bills. But the DC Mediation Institute source makes this incredibly clear, and it's super empowering. Whether it is a proxy war in the Middle East threatening global shipping routes, a simmering interdepartmental dispute in your workplace, or a bitter argument with a neighbor over property lines, the fundamental physics of the conflict are identical.
Because the underlying psychology of escalation and grievance does not change based on the size of the dispute or the budget involved.
Exactly. So what does this all mean? It means the solution is the same. Structured, impartial dialogue applied early is infinitely cheaper and less destructive than waiting for the situation to deteriorate.
Yeah, think about a workplace. If you address a misunderstood email on day one, it's a 5-minute conversation.
But if you wait a month, departments are paralyzed, HR is involved, and productivity crashes.
Exactly. Intervening at the source before the pipes burst saves the foundation of the building.
It always comes back to Unit 4B.
It does. But, looking closely at all these case studies together, I want to leave everyone with a final thought, because there is a very uncomfortable implication that arises from this new policy model.
Okay, what is it?
Well, the sources clearly document that conflicts in places like Ukraine or Yemen triggered massive, immediate global responses. The international community rushed in with resources and mediation teams, largely because those conflicts disrupted vital, universally needed markets: wheat, fertilizer, oil.
Right, the economic pain was felt everywhere, so the motivation to intervene was super high.
Exactly. But the policy report also details the conflict in the Sahel region of Africa, a regional tragedy that displaced over 3 million people.
Over 3 million people displaced.
Yes. Yet, the researchers explicitly categorize the Sahel conflict as having a, quote, low global trade impact because the region doesn't export strategic, globally critical commodities. So it begs a serious question about the future of this joined-up approach. If this highly pragmatic new model relies heavily on proving that a conflict has global economic spillovers in order to justify the budget for preventative mediation, what happens to the populations in conflicts that don't threaten global markets?
Do they just get ignored?
Right. Do wars in resource-poor regions risk being completely ignored by the international community? By trying to make a practical economic argument for peace building, this new approach might secretly be placing a literal dollar value on peace.
Man, that is a heavy, necessary question to ponder as we look at how the world allocates its resources. Does the global community only mobilize for peace when it threatens the price of a barrel of oil or a bushel of wheat? It is definitely something to critically consider the next time you look at a map of global interventions. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive today. We really hope it provided a new lens through which to view the news. The next time you read a headline about a crisis over there, look for the hidden connections. Trace the economic and demographic ripples. And remember, whether it's a geopolitical standoff or a leaky pipe in Unit 4B, the absolute cheapest time to fix a problem is always right now. Take care.